Welcome to Walking with Conviction in an Anxious Age. Every day, thousands of things compete for your attention. Notifications, news, work, family, social media, entertainment. And most of us think those things simply occupy our time. But what if they're doing something more? What if your attention is quietly shaping the person you're becoming? In today's episode, we're going to discover that none of us drifts into becoming the person we hope to be, but instead our everyday habits repeated over time quietly form our character, our loves, our fears, and our faith. The question isn't whether you're being formed. The question is who or what is forming you. Last week, we started with the principle of the path. The idea that we're all on a path, whether we realize it or not, and that path has a destination. And when we're on a path, we can't change the destination of the path. We can change the path, but not the destination. And it's good to realize that we're on that path. And we talked about the ordinary habits of extraordinary faith. And the series is called Learning to Live. We also talked about the rule of life. Everyone has one. And the one we have puts us on the path to the destination we're moving towards. I think one of the keys to formation is becoming aware of the fact that we are being formed and also what it is that's forming us, because formation mostly happens slowly over time through simple everyday habits, things we do every day that we don't often even think about. One of the most valuable commodities in the world today is attention. Everyone is competing for your attention. Social media does it. Everybody on social media is trying to gain attention. I'm trying to get attention with this podcast, to be honest. Companies compete for attention because attention changes behavior. And of course, in the case of companies, they want to change your spending behavior. But attention goes deeper than that. Whatever catches your attention begins to shape your life. Dramatic moments can be formative. We've talked about suffering, and suffering can be formative, but it's often everyday, ordinary moments and habits that we repeat over time that are the most formative. But they're incrementally small. It's not one notification or news article or YouTube video. It's years of attention paid that forms us. It's a steady rhythm of what we repeatedly choose to give our attention to. Every small decision we've made in the past has compounded over time to form us into who we are today. And that's going to continue into the future. God has created us with the ability to adapt and change our lives. I think it's amazing how adaptable human beings are. And modern neuroscience refers to that as neuroplasticity. Every time we think a thought, perform an action, or respond to something in a particular way, there are groups of neurons in our brain that fire together. And as we repeat the same patterns over time, the connections between those neurons, they get stronger and they become more efficient. And repeated practices are shaping the person that we are becoming. It's a pattern you can see and illustrate in God's creation. You think about walking through bush or tall grass. The first time you do that, you have to push through it, chop your way through it, whatever you need to do. It's not easy. It's actually quite hard. But if you walk the same path every day, eventually you form a path. And over time, that becomes a path of easiest or least resistance. And it becomes the easiest path to follow. And this similar kind of thing happens in our mind. And we naturally tend to follow the path of least resistance. Whatever we do repeatedly over time eventually becomes the path of least resistance in our brain. And I watch that happening in my grandson almost every day. He's just over a year old now. And it's amazing how fast kids at that age grow. Things that were once very difficult for him are now just something he does without thinking. They're second nature, and he knows a few words. And I think his favorite way to communicate right now is to point and say that. And that can mean a lot of different things. But my daughter, Caitlin, has taught him some sign language. And that's given him the ability to communicate some needs before he's developed speech pathways. He can sign more and food and water and please, which is super cute because he uses both arms when he does it. And I was leaving the house the other day and he started crying and he was sitting there on the floor and his head was down and tears were rolling down his face. His lip was pooched out. He looked really sad. I said, "Would you like me to pick you up?" And he signed please. And yeah, that was very touching. I'm not a very squishy guy, but that kind of got me. But neural pathways, they grow stronger over time with repetition, but that doesn't mean we're trapped or incapable of change either. What it means is that the habits that we practice every day become the path of least resistance. And we can choose what those are. Someone might say, that's just the way I am. But a more accurate statement might be, this is the easiest way for me to be. And we don't want to underestimate the path of least resistance formed over time. But by the same token, we don't want to misunderstand that the neural pathways that form ordinary habits, uh, they don't produce extraordinary faith. The Holy Spirit does that. And we can't simply reorganize ourselves into being more like Jesus through just discipline and well-formed habits and willpower. At the same time, though, God works through discipline and well-formed habits, sometimes understanding the balance between the part we play in spiritual growth and the part the Lord plays can be challenging to understand. But God did create us to become like whatever we consistently behold. And that's why Scripture says, we all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image. And it says something similar in Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And conformed is kind of like being changed from the outside in, whereas transformed is being changed from the inside out. And I suppose that's similar in the comparison we make between the habits we form and how God works through those. But attention is more than just noticing something. It's it's one of God's appointed means of transformation. Whatever consistently occupies our attention gradually shapes our character. And Jesus illustrated many of his teachings through agricultural metaphors, parables. He talked about agricultural things a lot because the culture at the time was very agrarian, and those illustrations he used were very relevant to the people he was speaking to. They knew exactly what he was talking about because everyone was very closely connected with agriculture. The economy was built on it. I think that many of those agricultural metaphors Jesus used are also relevant to the reality of how our brain works and how God works within that. Like a farmer works the soil, plants the seed, waters the ground, and then God causes the seed to grow and eventually produce fruit. There's only so much the farmer can do before God has to take over. But at the same time, if the farmer doesn't do his part, there won't be any harvest. My grandfather was a farmer. He smelled like a lifetime of diesel, sawdust, and axle grease. He had those like deep lines in his hand that were just permadirt. It was like, yeah, it was like it was never completely clean. If once in a while if he was going into town, he might mix it up with a bit of Old Spice. But I love the smell of diesel and sawdust and axle grease. People think I'm a little weird, but I really do like those smells. And as a boy, I spent a lot of time riding on the tractor with him while he planted fields. And occasionally he'd even let me drive, which was a lot of fun. And some years he planted alfalfa seed for cattle feed. He had dairy and beef cows as well. And alfalfa seeds are tiny. If you have one in your hand and you drop it, you probably wouldn't find it again. They're quite small. They're like 1.5 millimeters. And it takes, I think, 400 of them to make up a gram. And I estimate he probably planted close to 1 billion seeds in a growing season for alfalfa. And that's a lot of seeds. Of course, you have to till the soil, plant the seed, and irrigate it. And that's a lot of time and repetition. But if the farmer doesn't give his time and attention to planting seed and a lot of seed, there won't be a harvest. But he doesn't actually cause the seed to grow. By the same token, we practice the ordinary habits of faith over and over time, and we trust God to bring the growth. The practices that we do can't replace what God does, but He can use ordinary habits to produce extraordinary faith in us. And God has created us in such a way that ordinary habits practiced over time are not only formative, but they also grow stronger. And our habits form a path of least resistance. But I don't know if I'd call it unfortunately, God also gave us the pesky ability to make our own decisions and decide what those habits will be. You know, we're all autonomous beings. We're all responsible for the decisions we make. I sometimes wish that God would unscrew the top of my head and let the hamster out and then just dump in everything I would ever need, and that would be it. But that's not how things work. We're responsible for our own decisions, and the decisions we make are forming us. The habits that we create are forming us. They're forming our rule of life. And knowing that, we should be concerned about the daily habits that build our rule of life. That's why our attention matters, is because it begins with attention. We're all giving our attention to something every day, all day, day in, day out, days, months, years, decades, and over the course of a lifetime. Whatever repeatedly receives our attention eventually forms our habits. And it may not feel like it, but our attention is never neutral. It's always on the road to formation. What you continually think about and return to forms ordinary habits. And many habits are not bad. They might even be good habits. But whatever you give attention to will influence your decisions, your relationships, your fears, your hope, and even your faith. And habits may not be bad habits, but are they the habits that we want to be formative? And giving something your attention is like cultivating seed. It's a biblical principle. You reap what you sow, and there are a multitude of things competing for our attention today. I think that today's believers are they have more opportunity for distraction. They have more things competing for their attention than any generation of believers before us. And our attention is limited because our time is limited. And one thing about people today is many people are also time poor. I felt very time poor this past week. I performed a wedding for a young guy in our church, great young man, married a nice young lady, and I'm super happy for him. I performed the wedding, and he asked me to be the master of ceremony. So it was a lot of fun. It's great. But I was also moving this week, and yeah, so time was very, very short. And I know I'm not alone in that. I know everyone I know is very busy. And what receives our attention is often dictated by the time we have available. And sometimes we're genuinely busy and that's just the way it is, but that's not always the case. And one of the things that I respect about you is that you're here listening to this, or that you're taking the time to listen. And I understand that most of you have great demands on your time. That's reality. And I appreciate you taking the time to listen. It matters. It matters. And I can empathize with the fact that we're all very busy. And it'd be wonderful if we had enough time and attention to give as much as we wanted to everything we need and want to give it to, but that's just not reality. That's just not reality. The thing we want to avoid with our time and attention is, instead of spending our time and attention, is allowing busyness to spend us. In Psalm 90 is a prayer that was written by Moses. And when you think about the life of Moses spent 40 years being formed in Pharaoh's palace. Then he spent 40 years being formed as a shepherd in the wilderness. I guess you can kind of say he was on the run from the law. And then another 40 years leading the Israelites in the wilderness. And he was put under a lot of pressure, a lot of stress as their leader. There were times when he was time poor. He was overwhelmed with all the work he had to do. He also watched an entire generation die in the wilderness. So he knows firsthand that life is fragile, it's fleeting, and it's demanding. In Psalm 90, verse 12, this is what he prays. He says, "So teach us to number our days, that we may apply our hearts to wisdom." And with his life experience and knowing what he does, he doesn't ask God for more hours in the day or a longer life or even fewer responsibilities. He says, teach us to number our days so that we can apply our hearts to wisdom. It's kind of like he's saying, teach us to live with the awareness that our days are precious and limited. Our time is limited. And time is our most precious resource. We're always spending it, and we can't make more of it. It's finite. There's only so much of it, and we can't make more of it. And if we're honest, we don't think much about that. But consider this for a moment. For each and every one of us, there will be a last time that we walk through our front door of our home. There will be a last time that we get in a car and drive somewhere. There will be a last time maybe that we hug someone we love. But there will be a last time for all of those things. And it's coming sooner than we think. I'm shocked how fast life goes by. But we live with the assumption that there's always going to be another opportunity, but that's not necessarily the case. That's an uncomfortable thing to think about, and nobody really enjoys that. But there's an advantage to doing so and facing that, because it helps us recognize that every day is a gift. It's not a guarantee, and time is limited. We can't stop spending it, but we do have choices in how we spend it. Time passes regardless of how you spend it, whether you waste it or spend it well. It's passing, it's being spent. Your rule of life, the path you're on, the person you're becoming, time is passing, whatever that is. And recognition of that is what Moses is praying for. And he's praying that so that we may apply our hearts to wisdom. Because when you face the fact that your life is limited, you start to ask different questions when you think hard about that. Instead of how can I fit more into my day, you might ask, what actually matters today? What is it that's most important today? You ask questions that determine how you spend your limited time and attention, rather than being caught up in the tidal wave of busyness and things that that want to spend you. I think one of the deceptions of contemporary culture, at least Western culture, is not that it tells us we have too little time, but it distracts us from the fact that our days are numbered. We rarely think about that. We think, oh, we have too little time, we'll do that later. But we're distracted from the reality that we only have so many days. And we often excuse something by saying, I'm too busy right now, I'll do it later. But the time keeps passing and the habit gets stronger. Over time, our habits, the path of least resistance, is stealing our time and attention. Or it might be, depending on what it is. The amount of time we have, though, in this, the amount of time we have isn't the point. What receives our attention within the time God has given us is really what matters. This is where understanding and forming your rule of life becomes so important. A rule of life is not about adding more to your schedule. It's not that. It's about intentionally deciding what deserves a place in your life, what deserves a place on your schedule. When Moses prays, teach us to number our days, that kind of sounds like time management, but he isn't praying for a better organized to-do list. He's praying for the recognition that time is finite and a wise heart in that understanding. He's praying for a right to-do list. And the reality is we can't give our attention to everything. We can't give our time to everything. Understanding that time is a finite resource means choosing ahead of time what will receive our attention before the world chooses for us, because it will. Something is going to decide where your time goes. And I want that to be you, because something's going to decide. And when it chooses and it's not you, you're no longer spending your time, it's spending you. Every day, we are spending our attention somewhere. Every conversation, every habit, every decision, every thought is an investment. It's an investment of our attention and our time. And all those seemingly small, all of those decisions, thoughts, they culminate, they form habits, and habits get stronger. Moses doesn't pray, Lord, give us more time. He prays, teach us to number our days that we may apply our hearts to wisdom. And the reality is that every yes is also a no. We say yes to one thing, we're saying no to something else. Every choice to attend to one thing is a choice to neglect another. Every habit, decision, and choice is forming us. And one of the big differences between biblical wisdom and cultural wisdom is how each one views limits. Uh, for instance, culture defines enough by what it's not. I don't have enough. I don't have enough money. I don't have enough time. I don't have or do enough. And when you ask, well, okay, well, how much is enough? The answer is probably going to be more than I have now or a little bit more. There's no defined limit. And one of the marks of biblical wisdom is learning to accept the limits God has built into our lives. We're not infinite. We have limits. We can't be everywhere. We can't do everything. We can't solve every problem. We can't meet every need. When we refuse to put limits on ourselves, what we're really doing is we're rebelling or pushing back or rebelling against God's design for us. Even Adam and Eve, who were created before sin entered the world, were still finite. Less so than us, but they're still finite humans. They could only be in one place at a time. They could only have one conversation at a time. They still needed food. They lived within the boundaries God had established. So being finite is not sinful. Realizing that is not sinful. Realizing that every yes is also a no is not sinful. It's part of God's design for us. It's normal. Adam and Eve were supposed to follow one rule. Don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Wouldn't that be nice? One rule to follow. But the reality is one of us ended up breaking it anyway. The problem was not that Adam and Eve were limited. The problem was that they refused to live joyfully within the limits that God had established. The first sin in the Bible was a rejection of the limits God had set. God said, you may eat from every tree except one. And then the serpent said, those limits are keeping you from something better. And every sin since then has echoed the same lie. God's boundaries are restrictions rather than gifts, when the truth is, God's boundaries are not restrictions, they're gifts. Part of a biblical rule of life is the joyful acceptance an understanding of the God-given limits that help us flourish. Only God is unlimited. When we try to live as though we have no limits, we are attempting to carry a weight that God never intended us to bear. He never expected us to do everything and carry everything. We often find, well, I find that our exhaustion doesn't usually come from obedience, but from trying to bear things that God never intended us to carry. And they can even be good things. And that's why it's kind of difficult. But Jesus understood it perfectly. In the book of Mark, we read about Jesus, and there's a scene in there where we read it was still very early in the morning, and Jesus went to a solitary place to pray. Maybe you know the passage I'm talking about. And it wasn't long before the disciples found him and they started placing demands on him. And, hey, there are crowds of people waiting. There's sick people who need healing and all of these things. There's demands placed on him. People need things. And there was always more ministry for Jesus to do. And Jesus loved people more than we can understand, but he didn't rush back just because people demanded his attention and his time. And the way he responds to that is very interesting. He basically said, let's move on to the next town so I can preach there too, because that's why I'm here. Jesus was never driven by urgency and demands. He was governed by purpose. That's one of our values here at our church is we serve motivated by purpose, not compulsion. And that's an important distinction. Urgency is often created by the expectations of others, the demands of others, the things people around us want. And I might step on toes a little bit here, but we're not talking about rest. Rest is important, but that's a different topic. This is not about time away from work. It's not about not working hard. It's about working hard at the right things and not wasting time on the things that are a waste of time. Purpose is found in God's calling. People seek purpose. That's where you're going to find it. Purpose will be difficult. Sometimes it's difficult to fulfill your purpose. I've found ministry often difficult, but purpose puts limits on urgency and demands. And many of us live under the tyranny of the urgent. There's always something more wanting to get our attention, and always something more wanting our time, always demands being placed on us. And we often try to meet all of the expectations and demands that people put on us or life puts on us. Now, when you think about it, if Jesus had done that, say when he was going to go to the next town and preach, if he had done that, we'd be reading a different Bible. I mean, he limited himself to being a human. And if he had continually went back and tried to fulfill all the demands and expectations that were placed on him, he would not have fulfilled the mission his Father had given him. Even in the life of Jesus, there was really no finish line on the ministry he did or was that people wanted him to do. But there was a finish line in the purpose God had for him. Instead, he accepted the limits of his humanity and he worked towards his purpose. And he entrusted the rest to his Father. And he knew how to do that, and we can learn a lot from him. He accomplished God's plan of redemption by going to the cross and paying the price for sin with his blood. And when we place our trust in him, we receive what he did for us as a gift. Because he said yes to his Father and his purpose, he had to say no to a lot of other things, but he accomplished what God had for him. And every believer benefits from that. Wisdom understands that every yes requires a no. Every decision about where we give our attention is also a decision about where we don't give it. That isn't failure. We often feel guilty or bad because we can't do everything that we want to do, or we can't fulfill everyone's expectations. But sometimes it's not failure, it's faithfulness. We don't need to carry the weight of the whole world. Jesus already did that. Our responsibility is to be faithful with the time, attention, and opportunities God gives us today. That's our responsibility. And I'm going to give you a few things that will hopefully help you as you walk that path. Grow, live, go, just like we do every week. Grow. Ask God to reveal what is shaping your rule of life. What is forming you? Spend some time this week asking an honest question. What consistently receives my attention? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it what I want it to be? Is it what it should be? Is God receiving my attention? And pay attention to your daily rhythms. And what do you do when you get up in the morning? What do you reach for first thing in the morning? For a lot of us, it's probably our phone. What fills the gaps in your day? What occupies your mind when your mind is free to think? What do you think about? Pray and ask the Lord to reveal the habits that are quietly forming you over time. And live. Choose one habit, just one, that intentionally redirects your attention towards God. Don't try to overhaul your entire life this week, because I've tried that. It doesn't work. It's too much to do at once. And that's not the way God works. Anyway, He works through everyday decisions and habits over time. And so don't try to do too much at once. And it's probably, it'll probably end up failing anyway. We often say, we don't have enough time. And occasionally that's generally true. I felt that way this past week. I felt like that was generally true. But if we're honest, more often than not, when we say we don't have enough time, what we're really doing is choosing the path of least resistance, because it's a habit we've already formed and it's easier. It's a path of least resistance. But time is kind of like finances. If we wait until all the bills are paid before we give generously, we probably won't give at all. But if we give to God first, He'll line the rest of it up. But we have to trust Him to do that. It's the same with our time. And, some of you may already be doing well at this, but starting today, choose one simple, ordinary practice. It doesn't have to be anything major. It can just be a few minutes, just somewhere that you'll actually start with something you'll actually do. And you can choose what that is. It might be reading a chapter of scripture before you check your phone in the morning. And it could be finding a place without distractions like Jesus did and spend 5 minutes in prayer. It might be a different room in the house. It might be on a walk, but spend a few minutes in prayer and have lunch without your phone. Instead of scrolling social media, read a couple verses of scripture and think about them. And then repeat that daily. Small habits, faithfully repeated, become the pathways God often uses to form extraordinary faith. Last thing, go. Give someone your full attention this week. You ever go maybe out to lunch with somebody and they've got their phone and they like turn it upside down but leave it on the table, like, oh, well, I'm not going to pay attention to that. But the reality is it's still there and it buzzes and carries on. And that's just one example of many, many things. But one of the greatest gifts you can give someone is your undivided attention. I found that when I sit in counseling with people, one of the greatest gifts you can give someone is your undivided attention. And unfortunately, that's kind of rare. But put your phone away and listen without rushing. Actively listen to what someone says. Listen without thinking about what you're going to say next. Just listen to what they have to say and choose presence over distraction. Well, thank you for joining me today. And I'd like to leave you with one final question and one request. And if you're going to take one thing away to think about today, what consistently receives your attention? And you don't have to change everything today, but start with one small habit, one intentional choice, one faithful step toward Jesus. And if today's episode encouraged you, I'd love for you to follow the podcast wherever you listen. Leave a review, share this episode, like it, whatever you can do on the platform you're on. I'd be very appreciative of that. And share it with someone who feels overwhelmed by the pace of modern life, who is just overwhelmed with all the distractions, and they're not spending their time is spending them. Well, next week we'll continue our series, Learning to Live, as we discover more about the ordinary habits God uses to produce extraordinary faith. Until next time, keep walking with conviction in an anxious age.
Thank you for listening to Walking with Conviction in an Anxious Age. As you go, remember, following Jesus isn't about having all the answers, but walking faithfully with the truth you've been given. Stay present, think clearly, walk intentionally. And wherever Jesus leads you this week, keep walking, faithful, grounded, and free.